Hi everyone. Today my copy of Alien Covenant came in the mail, so what I'd like to do is provide a commentary track by watching the film and recording my commentary as the film plays. All you have to do to participate is push play at the time that I acknowledge, and you should be able to listen to my commentary as you watch the film. Without further ado, I'm going to push play, starting now. Slight delay here. We're about 5 seconds in. It's the 20th century fanfare. It's interesting, of course, to compare it to the original, which is much more static. Different color scheme, and the music, of course, sounds much different. And here we have Odysseus shooting the arrow through the hatchet heads, TSG Entertainment. I don't recall seeing them in any other film. Perhaps they're a new company. I'm not sure. Here we have Scot-Free Entertainment. And I'll try and avoid having just a play-by-play commentary. I want to try and discuss some of the thematic elements as well if I can. But it's dark, and we have the opening credit sequence, very much like in the opening sequence for 1979. The title credits roll. And Judd Kurzel's score, which I always enjoyed in this film. If I had to compare it to Prometheus or some of the other Alien films besides the original or Aliens, I think I'd rank it up there with Alien 3, Elliot Goldenthal's score. And this eye is of course very reminiscent of 1981's Blade Runner, with the eye overlooking the city. Ridley Scott always described that as perhaps Big Brother. It didn't necessarily have to be Roy Batty's eye. I like this shot too, where you have the height of the throne essentially acting as the length of the height from the ceiling to the floor in that particular shot. Of course, you have a lot of classic pieces of art here, and I always thought that they were fairly selective in their choices. I like that Wayland is dressed in dark. That's sort of a dark copper green almost. It almost looks black. And then you have David, who of course is dressed in white. And he is very much a parallel visually to the statue Michelangelo's David. I like some of the photographic quality of some of these shots. If you look in the background, you can see the birds swanning or sailing over the lake. But again, you have this visual parallel between the newly born David and the statue. The statue is, of course, I think much larger than it was originally, but I was wondering, of course, Peter decides to choose Wagner, and he could be a classical aficionado, but of course Das Rheingold, or Entry of the Gods into Valhalla, is a very specific choice. Wayland says, of course, that it's somewhat anemic without the orchestra, and it makes me think perhaps in this stage David is a bit anemic in his personality. He has the idea of what it means to be a god, but he doesn't really have the full mental development of his faculties to really sort of bring the music to life. Also a commentary on technology. All he has in front of him now is a piano. It's interesting too, you have Peter Wayland's actor, his name is escaping me off the top of my head, but he decided to reprise his role as Wayland in this film, even if only for one particular scene. And then, of course, later on in the film, we'll have James Franco, who is destroyed rather quickly. It's interesting to see how people will sort of volunteer to be in Ridley Scott films, even if only for a moment. Seems like a lot of people in the industry have nothing but respect for the man. You have Wayland sort of sitting down in his chair, like a king. I love David's performance here. It's a bit different. Wayland is a bit more subdued, or one could even call him somber or surly. And instead of giving him a response to the question, he just orders him, "Bring me the tea. Bring me the tea." I like this shot here, of course, where David rises and he walks, and as he's walking, he remains perfectly in between the ceiling and the floor. You can see his reflection on the glass and him pouring the tea. It's a very photographically pleasing scene, I think. It's very static or sterile, like Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then as he hands him the tea, you have this transition from him standing there to outer space, and you have the letters slowly forming, just like they did in 1979. If you look closely in the upper left-hand corner, you can even see the ship slowly floating through outer space, very much in the same fashion as it did in Prometheus, except it's taking its time to travel across the screen a bit more than it did in that film. I think the music works pretty well with this shot, too. Of course, it's ripped entirely from Jerry Goldsmith, but classical composers, according to my brother, would often steal music directly from each other. It was considered in those days to be a sign of respect. I kind of prefer the way that the text appeared in Alien, where it's just a single paragraph of white text that fades into vision and then fades to black. Here it's more like a computer screen. And you have the ship, of course, that is slowly kind of floating through space. It's not shooting through space like it would in Star Trek. And the shots, of course, in this film are so quickly, it's hard for me to comment on them before the shot is over. I'm trying to do my best. It's a very fast film. If I had to be entirely honest, these sails that we see in front of us, I always thought they looked a little cartoony. I mean, what exactly would gigantic solar sails look like? But if I had to be honest, if I had to say what special effects shot in this film didn't look the most convincing, it would be perhaps some of these outer space, these shots of the Covenant from outer space. This is a pretty good shot, though, of it. An establishing shot once the sails have been fully extended. You also have a dream sequence, here, or rather a lack thereof, where Walter is checking on Daniels, but his way of doing it is vastly different than David in Prometheus. You have the quickest cameo in the world by James Franco. Originally, I believe they wanted to have more flashbacks of him in the film to kind of round out his performance, but they decided to cut some of those out. I'm hoping in time we get a director's cut of the film. And we have David here, who's Walter, rather. And this is a coda for the film, because in the beginning of the film, we have him opening up the eggs and checking on them. And then at the very end of the film, we'll have him doing the same exact process, placing it into some type of container filled with what I assume is liquid nitrogen, maybe. But again, a nice visual coda. The sound effects, the hissing as he shuts the drawer of the shelf. I wish I actually knew what neutrinos, as far as I understand it, are subatomic particles, so I'm not sure. I don't think this is actually technically a space anomaly, but maybe I'm wrong. But if they're subatomic particles, how could they interact with the ship? And again, you can see, as far as I can tell, he's actually walking through an entire hallway. Like you can really see the size or scale of it. And if I understand, the ship has actually been sort of repurposed, anyways. We have the crew members who are sort of dangling, if you will. All right, we have Billy Crudup here, and he's telling Daniels to wake up. I like some of these shots. You have the free motion camera as Walter walks through the hallway, and him grabbing a fire extinguisher in a similar sense that they did in. And if you see, the entire room is actually rocking and swaying. You can see the headsets swinging from the ceiling. Branson, played by Franco, is of course barely awake here. We don't even really have time to see him react before he's engulfed in flames. I always kind of enjoyed this scene, though. The idea that you have someone die partway through in the beginning of the film. You know, you don't start off, you don't really introduce anyone. It's in medias res. You know, it starts in the middle of things. And the focus here isn't on the captain, who we see now being carried away on a yellow tarp. It's about the survivors. And I like that, because again, in Alien, we all know that who we thought was the hero isn't actually the hero. So we have this captain character, and we think, okay, is this guy going to be the hero? Nope. The delivery is perhaps a little bit different than it was in Alien, but that shot kind of reminds me of the deleted scene from Aliens, where Ripley is sitting in front of a reflected image of a park while she's actually inside an office waiting for Burke to deliver her news about her mother, actually. So you have a nice little nod to Aliens there. I also like the music in this particular shot. It's one of the few pieces I think that Kurzel actually wrote that sounded like his own music. There's so many nods to Jerry Goldsmith. And she's holding a square nail. This would have been something that they would have used to build the cabin on the lake, which is of course the name of this particular piece of music. She's making a necklace out of it. Kind of reminds me of Conan the Barbarian, where you had the jewel of the serpent. Unfortunately, I believe this is the only bit of exposition or flashback that we have with James Franco's character. I'm not actually sure where they are at this moment. I do think that they would have had a bit more emotional impact with Franco's character dying had they provided some more flashbacks, I think. But again, this is a very expeditious film. She has to give her husband a little pep talk. And Krenop is actually one of my favorite characters, just because he's put into a situation where he knows that people really don't respect him or listen to him. Imagine, again, just like Ripley in Alien, where you have this third officer reporting the warrant officer, and no one in the film listens to her. And it's interesting to have someone be placed in that position who isn't actually Ripley, for a change. Of course, the ceiling in this shot is, you have the establishing shot of all the characters sitting around the table. The ceiling is almost glowing, almost from candlelight. They have reserve power, but it seems as though they're also using some alternate light source to kind of light the ship. I really enjoy the if you sort of compare the images on the monitors to the ones in 1979, they had to animate all of those by hand. And in this film, I think they've done a really good job to sort of animate a lot of the screens. I've heard of solar wind, of course, but I'm not entirely sure if it would operate in the same sense that we think. Solar wind is radiation, it's not actual wind, but you have to keep in mind that everything that occurs in this film is largely symbolic. you don't have a ship that's traveling at faster than light travel through outer space. You have a ship that it's essentially sailing through outer space, very much like a ship would have done, say, in the days of Moby Dick. I like that Walter is, of course, unable to recognize initially that that's a question. They have to clarify that for him. You have to keep in mind that he is a creature or a creation that is unable to think in the same way that David did. He's much more robotic, much less playful. I like Billy Crudup's character, Orem, who's kind of making a good call here. He's like, look, we have to repair the ship. Time enough to grieve when the moment is appropriate to grieve, but if we don't actually repair everything, we're all dead. And I know people call him kind of stupid, but it makes a fairly good point. It's a situation where they really don't have the time to grieve, though perhaps it could have been a little bit more visually urgent. In Alien, when they land on the ship, there's smoke and fire everywhere, and there was a scene like that earlier in this film too, of course, but now they're sort of in the eye of the storm, so to speak, and they have to make some difficult calls. I like that. You have some sort of nods to Ridley Scott's photography from Alien. You have a strong light source shooting through a door, lots of smoke, obviously. It's very visual, and the size of this ship on the inside is fairly similar to some of the cathedral-like rooms in Alien. Not entirely realistic, but certainly a nod to the Gothic architecture of that space castle that we saw that was the Nostromo and Alien. We have a situation here where Daniels is, of course, talking to a doll in a situation where, if you ever read Calvin and Hobbes, and Calvin's mother is upset, so she starts talking to Hobbes in this one particular strip. It's with the sick raccoon, if I remember. And in this situation, it's interesting because Daniels has a certain kind of friendship with this doll-like entity, Walter, and he's not human in the same sense. He doesn't understand what she's saying in a way that he could, say, empathize. But here she is, in a situation where she's not allowed to grieve in any way. The only avenues open to her are to sort of vent to an entity that will never fully empathize with her. And he's, of course, very logical in this situation, and he says, well, you promised him that you would build this cabin on the lake. That's why. It's not a silly idea. But it's very logical, very much like Spock and Kirk and Star Trek. You have a little bit of mutiny here, of course, where Orm is watching some of these characters who are sort of resisting their captain's order to get to work immediately because they want to acknowledge the death of the captain. You have to keep in mind in this situation, we didn't have time to really respond to Orm's superior, his death. He goes on through the living. He's dead at this point, and we have to kind of establish any type of bond with him we establish through the characters that survive him and keep him alive in their hearts, effectively. And then we realize, of course, that what they're doing is this is the scene just like in Alien. Does anyone have anything left to say? And it's a little bit different, because in that film, none of those characters had anything to say about the person who had died. And the captain, of course, in this film was a little bit more lucky. Chris. Of course, Orm is upset because he realizes that he's in a situation where It's interesting, though, he's complaining about the idea that he has a unfortunate situation that he's in where he's not trusted because he's a man of faith, and they say, oh, you can't make rational decisions. And I find that most of the decisions that Orem makes are actually pretty sound. I like this shot here. As far as I understand, this isn't actually a model. These actors, as far as I can tell, are actually green screening, and perhaps there are portions of what they're interacting with that are real. It's actually pretty scenic. It's almost a waltz-like quality to the music as they're making their repairs. I love this suit, too, the yellow suit that these two characters are wearing. They have the magnetic locks on their boots. If I'm not mistaken, the other guy in this suit is the guy who gets his jaw knocked off during the grass attack sequence. Yeah, Blondie here. You have the Christmas lights on their gauntlets. I thought that was kind of curious. Perhaps that, I'm not sure what those lights, those indicator lights are supposed to indicate. Yeah, they did a fabulous job designing these suits, though. That's one thing that I'll say about this movie is that everything about it in regards to the costumes and the set design is pretty solid. And you have this entire hallway. As far as I can tell, it's actually a hallway. It's not an optical illusion. They didn't use mirrors like they did in Aliens when they were opening up the hypersleep capsules. We discover that Orem isn't totally heartless in this situation. He's probably the most complex of all the characters. I have to wonder what type of device they're using to transmit these waves. I like that shot too, where Tennessee is sort of distracted by the communication of whatever he's interfacing with, and he's sort of floating dead through space. Some very Kubrick-like shots here. You have the shot, of course, where Tennessee is almost a speck next to the ship that he was about to board. Very much like the Nostromo against the surface of the planet in Alien. A lot of variety in those shots. You have the word collating, just like Ash in Alien. Almost sounds like a theremin there for a second. A very old school sound effect you hear in a lot of science fiction films. To be honest, I think Tennessee must have magic ears because I can't hear that. Evidently, the distress signal comes with coordinates, very much like the star map in Prometheus. Here we have a constellation, and essentially, apart from John Denver, which is the siren song to lure them, they also have a map to lead them directly into the trap. I like this shot too, of course, because it's not a star map that they use to find planets like they did in Prometheus. Here they have precise coordinates, which are essentially relayed to their ship. You have a perfect planet, and a lot of people say, well, why is this planet so perfect? Evidently, that planet is, as the Ricks, or whoever he is, said, that it's above and beyond the most optimistic projections for that planet that they actually vetted. I really like this conversation, of course. And in 7 years, 4 months, the possibility of another solar storm could happen any number of times. And the captain here has to make a call. And essentially what they're doing in this situation is they're trying to split the baby, as it were. It's not an easy choice to make, but if they continue on their current path, they'll arrive at a planet that isn't nearly as good as the one that's in front of them. That's assuming, of course, that they arrive because of the stormy weather of the sea that they're sailing through. You have to keep in mind that she's talking about simulations. They've vetted the planet, and yet the planet that they have in front of them is actually a planet that they don't need to simulate. Directly in front of them, it's real. They can touch it. And maybe it's too good to be true, but if you're out at sea in a situation where you may not make it to land, I don't think you would really question it as much as she is. But I like the fact that they have a bit of a conversation here about it. Another excellent point by Orm, as far as I can tell. I mean, would you want to get back into those pods after what happened to the captain? Which they could potentially endanger by leaving on board the ship and sailing to Origai 6. It's ultimately the captain's call in this situation. Good judgment based on all the data available, and I agree. I mean, I would make a similar call myself. But I like that they actually have two different voices here, and you can agree with Orm or you can agree with Daniels. But that's how it would be in real life, if you had a captain in a situation like this. I don't think you should necessarily agree with one or the other. You could take either side, but who's right in this situation? Now, of course, we found out later that Daniels was correct, but they had no way of knowing that based on the data that they had collected. You can see the shot of the ship floating between the planets. And again, the entire room sort of shakes, and you can see the wires and the cords and the headsets and the little there's a crystal skull next to one of the co-pilots. Lots of little props and things like that kind of leap out at you. You can almost see a halo or some type of aura around the planet. I'm not quite sure what that is. The music here works quite well in the same sense that it did it during the landing sequence in Alien. A bit of playful banter between some of the crew members. And these helmets I like because they're actually the exact same helmets worn by the Colonial Marine pilots in Aliens. Maybe they're in a little bit better condition, they have a different layer of paint, if you will, but they I love the shot, of course, of the hurricane underneath the ship as it's preparing to disembark. You have them counting down in unison with Mother's voice, just like an Alien. And you can see the screen sort of indicating that they have cleared the umbilical, so to speak. Yeah, just the shots of the outer space shots here in this film are really gorgeous. And you could say that they're behaving somewhat unprofessional here, but if you watch Aliens, you have to keep in mind that the banter between those crew members wasn't really any different. The crew of the Sulaco is very similar to the crew of the Covenant, and I think you have Ridley Scott sort of emulating some of what James Cameron did in his film, despite the fact that he's making his own film. When I first saw the film, I couldn't really understand what he said. This is why you need to do yoga. And this is interesting because essentially what you have is a situation where comms drop, but they're aware of it. Just like in Alien, where they start to go into the juggernaut, and there's this strange sort of lack of awareness when their comms shut down. In this movie, they're very aware of it. They know that the comms are shot. They have no way to communicate with each other. And you spend a lot of the film, of course, watching these people trying to deal with that kind of tension from being able to sort of communicate with the mothership. In Aliens, there was no need for that because everyone was on the planet. But in an Alien, they didn't really spend a lot of time on board the Juggernaut, to be perfectly honest. But in Alien Covenant, some very gorgeous shots. I believe this was filmed in New Zealand, or was it Australia? I forget. Some very sweeping establishing shots, along with the rising of the orchestral music. I think it all works very nicely. You have the amphibious ship landing in the water. And note that it touches down very neatly compared to in Alien. And yet at the same time, they're able to sort of maintain the tension by having it fly through the ionosphere of the planet and the storm. Now, at this point, the signal is still somewhat strong enough for them to communicate. But as soon as the storm begins, you have a bit of Chekhov's gun, danger, explosives. Because later, what happens to Ferris? She sets off a chain reaction with the ship. I love some of the lighting here. You have some of the white lighting behind the door of the ammo cabinet. And now they're opening the door to the amphibious craft. Everything is very nicely lit inside the ship. And at this point, people would be complaining, oh, why aren't they wearing helmets? But again, if you've ever seen an episode of Star Trek, or you've ever watched Forbidden Planet, or Star Wars, for that matter, no one ever wears a helmet. The only film that I can think of in the Alien universe where they wear helmets are Alien, Prometheus, and that's about it as far as exploring planets. Most of the time, people just don't. And blame it on writing tropes in science fiction films, but it's not something that they really think about too hard. Because again, you have to keep in mind they scan the planet. And had they found something in their sensors, because again, Mother, if you listen, is pointing out the contents of the atmosphere. Had they found something, you also have to keep in mind that the spores that they encounter are not something that is in the atmosphere itself. If the spores were in the atmosphere during the scan, perhaps the EA would have picked them up, but they're not. They haven't been activated yet. The defense mechanism is inactive. And really, you have to say to yourself, is Orm wrong to be excited? just like my mother, worse when she was happy. And again, she's bipolar. The interesting thing about this wheat is that it doesn't respond the same way that fungus does. Though fungus and plants belong to different kingdoms on the biological sort of rubric, because you have plants, fungi, animals, and archaea, I believe. And it's been a while since I took biology, but I think that's fairly accurate. But you'll notice that this wheat doesn't attack them, but the fungus does. But fungi are designed to emit spores. Perhaps that's intentional. I love this shot too, where it's sort of floating sideways over the surface of the planet. So they're, of course, trying to boost the signal, which is only going to get worse. I do think it's somewhat curious that they are trekking and splitting up, if you will. But you also have to keep in mind that they are packing weaponry. And if they're worried about lions, tigers, or bears, or anything equivalent to that, I think it's the same type of overconfidence that the Marines exhibit in Aliens when they land on that planet. Though the Marines, of course, were even more overconfident because they knew that there may be a xenomorph involved. Whereas on this planet, the xenomorph doesn't really exist yet. Sort of like the Tunguska blast where all the trees were leveled, nothing but a crater. So they're noticing that something is sort of rotten in Denmark here. And again, the whole purpose of this is just to sort of go hiking, essentially. And Daniels, of course, very astutely points out that there are no animals whatsoever. There is a reason for this. A free motion camera. I always enjoy free motion camera, and it's something you see quite a bit in Scott's films. Oh, I wish I knew the names of the characters. That's one thing I will say about this movie is you don't really have a lot of time to sort of say. You don't have pointed scenes in the movies where they're like, hey, so-and-so, and the movie just flies by so quickly that it's difficult to remember the names of the characters. But I've always been the kind of person that recognizes people by their faces anyways. So I'm like, hey, it's that guy with that face. So it's not really a problem for me, to be perfectly honest. There are, of course, a couple of characters in the film that do have actual human names that I can remember. Orm's wife is not one of them. That guy is not one of them. He's just Backburster Boy. He's going to have a smoke, of course. Lighting his cigarette the same way that Brett does in Alien, with a blowtorch. And of course, he steps on the spores, which have been weaponized by the deployment of the alien technology by David 10 years prior. Maybe this is like some anti-smoking ad. Smoking is bad for your health. You'll notice that the spores, as far as I can tell, are invisible to the naked eye. You have a weaponized sort of nanotechnology that, again, demonstrates the efficacy of the engineer weaponry. If this was a xenomorph, it would be much more obvious that he was in danger. But he has absolutely no idea. And of course, it's able to sort of infect and penetrate him without him really having any sort of clue. Except that he has an itchy ear, of course. Flicks his cigarette and off he goes, completely unaware that he has been infected. My grandfather always said that if you wanted to have a truly devastating weapon, have something that's infectious with a dormancy period, a latency period. It doesn't gestate immediately. It allows you to sort of expose the infected individual with other people as well. You'll have quite a lethal weapon indeed. A pandemic of sorts. some kind of vehicle. Now, of course, in Alien, a lot of the description that they have when they're describing is kind of rendered almost inaudible by the static or the interference from the radio signals when Ash and Dallas are communicating back and forth. And in this scene, of course, you don't have any of that. You don't have that camcorder type quality to, or the found footage like quality as they're making their way towards the ship. Everything is kind of presented in such a way that, it's not obscured in any shape or form. But there is a bit of obscuring going on, of course. Everything is fairly dark, obscured by darkness and shadows. And as they're making their way into the ship, you can't really see everything. Sort of like a haunted house, if you will. One of my favorite shots, of course. Just everything is sort of overgrown with moss. And you have Genius here who decides to stick his nose up and smell these alien spores. Not something I would have done personally. But he doesn't seem to have any idea that he's interacting with something that could be lethal. Again, he just itches his nose and goes on about his business. Not terribly bright, mind you, but again, they did scan the entire planet, and they weren't really able to find anything lethal. That doesn't mean that I would be going around, chewing on leaves or eating berries, but you have to say to yourself that any of the members of the colonial marines and aliens could have been infected by the secreted resin. Walking around without suits or protecting any type of protective gear. So it's a similar level of stupidity. It's, if you want to call it stupid. I call it a movie. It's meant to be entertaining. You have characters who are essentially wandering around inside a haunted house. Of course, Walter, being a computer, is able to recollect her name immediately. Like Data in Star Trek, or something equivalent. You have, of course, what appears to be part of Dr. Shaw's suit. A helmet. And she appears to have some paraphernalia of her and Charlie and things that we never... I love this shot here. Again, you can see the silhouette of the chair, but just about everything is in darkness. And then, of course, when they activate it here by touching the sphere, the ship almost comes alive. Kind of like Super Metroid when you activate the security measures of the planet Zebes. The ship, or the planet itself, sort of wakes up. Same idea here with the ship. And we had the message where Dr. Shaw is singing fucking John Denver. And as the message plays, you can see the entire ship around us revealed. I kind of like that. Instead of Dr. Shaw, they merely find a hologram or a recording, very much like Peter Weyland in Prometheus. By the time you hear this, I will be dead. It's a very common theme in a lot of films, not just science fiction films. Soldier Boy here is a little bit sick. She's like, hey buddy, what's wrong? I like it. They have little bits of cybernetic sort of stitching in their clothing. It's not something I noticed the first time I saw the film. I like their backpacks too. There's a lot of stuff hanging off the back end that just little details that you never notice. It's the kind of film that it flies by so quickly that you can never notice everything the first viewing. So Daniels and Walter decide to head back as well. Of course, the weapons that they're holding, the big black guy with the beard. Whoops. Almost looks like there's some real world equivalents. They've all been kind of mashed together. Now, these two are actually married in the script, but as far as I can tell, it's almost something that you have no idea. I like that cut too. It cuts to Tennessee, who has some type of pole dancer kind of doll, and they're all trying to communicate during this tense sequence, and the signal is so shoddy. And again, now you have a screen here where you can see their point of view as they're talking to Ferris. This is one of my favorite scenes in the film, actually. And people talk about this seeing like it's unrealistic. You have a certain amount of panic by Ferris after the creature is born. It kind of reminded me of XCOM, to be entirely honest. If you ever play that game and you have soldiers who panic in the presence of an alien threat to the point that they blind fire and blow themselves up accidentally, either by shooting something explosive or letting go of a grenade. So I'm not really bothered by that here. Ledward. I guess that's this character's name. I had no idea, but you can see his name. And then Kareen. Okay. Just like in Aliens, right? Some of the characters you don't actually hear their names. Where's Basky, right? The first time I heard his name in Aliens was you see his name on a screen because he has such little screen time. Well, Ledward here is not looking so hot. You have some free motion, and Kareen punches the console to let them into the room. Free motion camera, and again, you can kind of notice the camera guy sort of crouching here. You have some close-up shots, ECUs, and some cross-cutting as Tennessee is trying to figure out what's going on. Just like in Aliens. I didn't see what you got out of the cabinet there. I love some of the makeup effects here. Now, this is where you start to have panic. And people say, and you see the door's locked, and she realizes, okay, I've been locked in the room. And why is she panicking? People say, she's a pilot, she's supposed to be professional, right? Well, flying the ship's one thing, being in the presence of someone who just squirted blood out of their back. Maybe she has a phobia of blood. It's not uncommon. And again, she's not a doctor. And again, they're trying to communicate. They're like, okay, so-and-so is bleeding, they're sick, and they're trying to communicate, and there's sort of a lack or a failure to communicate, just like in Cool Hand Luke, right? And she is not handling the situation well at all. But again, just think XCOM, okay? You ever play that game? You have certain inexperienced members who are put into a situation where they're not used to combat. Clearly, Ferris is one of those. She just flies the ship. And I like the fogging up the windows from the condensation, their breath. The makeup effects on him look great, too. The sweat, the pale skin, the contacts. He's not looking very good at all. And of course, you have the spines that pierce out of his back. His skin almost stretches, or... Some excellent makeup effects here. Almost looks like they had a contortionist for that particular shot. When my brother saw that in the theaters, he burst out laughing. Again, you have this music that's kind of pulsating or just pump, 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 pump. Very much like when Michael Myers in Halloween is stalking Laurie Strode. And Kareen here is, of course, presented with an ostensibly harmless threat, a very small alien. And right next to Ferris, of course, you have the explosive tanks that she later punctures with her shotgun. And the entire time as we're cross-cutting and we have this flawed communication, you have this pulsating music, and I think it works better here than anywhere else in the film. And you'll notice that Ledward is still bleeding. Blood is constantly oozing from his back. Probably more to do with gravity than his heart beating, of course, at this point. He's probably dead. I was a little bit sort of discouraged by Kareen's inability to kind of put up a fight with the monster. She's not really even stabbing it with her knife. A lot of blood, too. Most of it appears to be I like that too when she slips on the blood. Again, she's not a combat expert. She's crawling away in panic. She leaves her weapon behind, shutting her foot in the door. And people have to keep in mind that this is to create tension. Like Sarah Connor in Terminator when her leg is injured and she has to crawl away. It's the same idea here with Ferris. Not entirely sold on some of the digital effects for the neomorph here. They definitely get better later in the film. She grabs the last rifle and decides to hide, of course. A direct hit, but again, it doesn't appear to be acidic blood. Of course, again, that warning from earlier, warning explosives. We have the firing, so to speak, of Chekhov's gun. If you look closely, too, if you didn't notice it, you could see the creature run down the ramp. Of course, all real pyrotechnics. Looks a lot better than fake explosions, obviously. So they spared no expense to actually destroy the landing ship here. Nice, satisfying little bang, if I do say so myself. Similar to the Marines being stranded on the planet in Aliens when Pharaoh dies. Pharaoh, Ferris, the similarities between their names, they're both pilots. And we see Kareen roll down the ramp, still on fire. And this guy, the other infected crew member, I don't even know his name. If you look, you can see the creature already starting to pop out of his mouth. A good reaction from Sergeant Lope, the actor who plays him. Again, I'm not very good with names. I'll call him Mustache Man. Pretty convincing reaction. I have to wonder if they pulled the same kind of stunt that they did in Alien when they didn't tell people what would happen. So maybe there's something of an actual genuine reaction when you see the thing pop out of the guy's mouth. Another establishing shot of the ship flying over the planet. I just love all of the shots. I think they did a really good job with that. The outer space shots. I can kind of understand his reaction, of course. He's like, oh, screw it. I know the tolerances. I want to take a risk here. And the voices of reason have to remind him, hey, we can't just fly the ship down. We have an establishing shot of them in the grass, the burning wreckage. Now it looks like we have some digital fire. It's funny how your eye can spot those little details. You have green lasers. Now, if you look, you can see in a very quick shot the wedding band of Sergeant Lope and his deceased partner, their hands next to each other. You have Rosenthal who points out, hey, buddy, forget him, he's gone, just like Vasquez and Drake and Hicks and Alien. Now, Walter, of course, has advanced eyesight. He's able to sort of say, hey, he's able to spot the threat before the others do. Now you have a hissing or smoking. I have to wonder if this comes from the circuitry. Oh. Now you'll notice that these creatures are actually being injured, and one of them being shot rolls into the grass, and yeah, they say, okay, there's another one. We have to assume at this point that one of them, they killed the other one, because we don't see it again in the film. Of course, so that means that David, I love this shot when he sets off the flare. Good sound editing. And you'll notice that Walter doesn't look away from it. All the other characters are blinded. And you'll notice that only one neomorph runs away from the fight. The other one ostensibly was wounded to such a degree that we don't see it again. Perhaps it died. And what do you do in a situation like this? Are you going to argue with him? I do wish, of course, that they would have acknowledged the guy who got his jaw knocked off. If they had said, hey, let's say something about that guy. But where's Vasky when he dies in Aliens? They don't really say very much about him either. And I'm just like, hey, where's Basky is dead. At the end of the scene, they say, hey, Sarge, and the others, their signs are real low, but they ain't dead, man. But they don't say anything about where's Basky, really. So every film has a Leibowitz or a red shirt like that. It's not uncommon. And now you have them running through the forest. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. And they pass through these tall pillars, which are actually pretty massive, built to scale. You're in a situation, of course, essentially the alien equivalent to Pompeii. And a lot of people sort of point out, hey, why don't they say anything? What is this? It's all they really do is sort of wonder out loud to themselves, maybe. But what are they going to do in this situation? They're stranded on the planet at this point. They have no way to communicate with the mothership. And that, as far as I know, was the main dropship of the Covenant. So they really have no way to get home until they establish comms. And they're, of course, being pursued potentially by this hostile alien life form. What can they do? Not really a time to stand around asking questions. If you look in the corner, you could see the waving trees where Elizabeth Shaw, we discover later in the film, is actually buried. And these shots actually remind me of The Thing by John Carpenter, where they find the mutated corpse. The giant rotating door, which I assume closes behind them, sealing them inside this necropolis, if you will. You can even hear in the background the door closing again behind them. Effectively, they're sealed in. Safe? Probably not. And it's a quick detail, just like when Windows drops the keys after he finds out that one of the other scientists at the Arctic Institute has been sort of possessed by the alien life form. He drops the keys, and all you can hear is a sound effect. It's just quick editing. Is it even safe here? Perfectly. And you'll notice that, again, this is a David model. He even explains, in case they're not entirely au fait on technology, that, again, he's the last surviving member of the doomed Prometheus expedition, just like Morbius and Forbidden Planet. We have David, of course, spinning some of his lies. Have we been infected? You'd know by now. And again, we have Orm, who's saying things that, as far as I can tell, are actually the voice of reason. And none of these things, again, showed up on the scanners. So as far as I'm concerned, they didn't really do anything wrong. They were lured here, it was a trap. But they had really no way of knowing. Kind of reminds me of Judge Dredd with the bomb signal. How many tons of concrete or floors of concrete does that signal transmit through? So they have to go to the roof. Sorry about the background noise. Railroad tracks run through the town where I live, so occasionally a train passes through in the night. Daniels is, of course, a little bit skeptical. So Walter's, ever the obedient slave, says brother to brother. Ricks. The storm is, of course, a new development, something that akin to maybe the Tempest in Prospero. You'll notice that the guy operating the radio is bleeding a bit. We have to ask ourselves if that's his blood or someone else's. More cross-cutting as we cut to Tennessee and Rix and his wife on board the ship. Kind of like Burke, we have the wife here who's saying, oh, hold on a second here, this whole installation is basically a thermonuclear or a giant nuclear fusion reactor. They fire their weapons in there, a thermonuclear explosion, adios muchachos. So in that movie, Aliens, Burke was the voice of reason. And the co-pilot here is essentially serving that role here. And we have, again, a situation where we have someone who's in command, arguing with people who aren't. Essentially mediation, if you will. So is anyone really fully in command here? And I like that. But again, this movie moves so quickly. Beautiful shot, of course. Very dark. Yeah, the free motion camera moves past a black curtain. Someone pointed out the distorted face of David as he's singing, saying maybe this is sort of foreshadowing to his madness to be revealed. Of course, he has a gigantic pair of scissors. They appear to be made out of metal. I'm not sure if there's something he made himself. We have Walter here in David's lab. Looks a lot different when they've lit it this way. Untested, Adam Savage had a chance to sort of look through this. He pointed out that this has a narrative of sorts, a visual narrative, where everything on the walls tells a story. Little cat feet. Carl Sandburg. Well, right off the bat, David is quoting poetry, but he only does it with Walter. And this is a scene that a lot of people sort of puzzle over. Motion activated lights, you'll notice, as David grabs himself a seat. Walter's holding what appears to be a flute or recorder. A lot of people sort of say or ridicule this scene because it is sexual in nature. There's a phallic quality to the two men blowing on each other's flute. I'll do the fingering. Blow. But it doesn't really feel that sexual to me. G to B flat. Is there anything sexual about that? Or any of the other musical terms that... And at the same time as all this is going on, we have a chance to sort of look at the illustrations. You can see an engineer on the wall behind Walter as he's blowing the flute. So we don't have to just listen to them. We can also take in our surroundings. And this is one of the longest takes in the film, about 5 minutes, where we can just look at everything on the walls. For most of the film, this doesn't happen. Of course, as the two people are talking, the camera is moving back and forth. And this is a chance for us to kind of study our surroundings, but also study the interactions between the characters. And we have David, who is perhaps letting his guard down a little bit and explaining how he feels about Wayland being unworthy of his creations. And he doesn't understand quite what he's dealing with. He doesn't fully understand that Walter isn't like him. So when he calls him brother, perhaps he doesn't quite realize that they're not as alike on the inside as David would perhaps like. It's interesting too, where Michael Fassbender, of course, plays the flute himself, and we have Walter is explaining why he can do what he does. He disturbed people. More like machines. Again, not the most sexual scene ever, and the fact that people sort of get their panties in a bunch about that particular bit. You do the fingering, I'll do the fingering, you blow. It just doesn't. Well, people say, why does she wander off by herself? Well, in a situation like this, maybe she needs a little bit of solitude. And according to David, they're perfectly safe. The door seals behind them, the tall oval-like door. We can hear it closing after they've entered. And one of the creatures died during the attack, as far as we can tell. They're in a place, of course, where there's no infectious material, no plants, no way to be infected. So why wouldn't she wander off? People could say, well, maybe they would close ranks at this point. Oh, Captain, my Captain. You have something of an interaction, of course, where they... And then, of course, this is the Isle of the Dead sort of homage with the trees. So I take that back. There are some trees here. But if people are paying attention, they were actually infected by spores from fungi. No fungus, hopefully. Could be wrong, though. We have a nice little flashback where, again, David is crying and thinking on what he did shortly after his arrival. As far as I understand it, this was another scene that they were thinking about cutting. You have some masculine and feminine characters. Some might say somewhat androgynous. And of course, the civilization that we're being presented with is fairly Roman or Grecian. It's not entirely advanced. The most advanced technology is the ship. This chandelier sort of formation as David prepares to drop the bombs. This is actually one of my favorite shots visually in the film. Like, it just looks cool. Sort of a helix. I love this. Something almost biblical about it. The plagues of Egypt. Plagues of locusts. Almost looks like insects sort of swarming about, tearing everyone to pieces. Men, women, children. I don't see any children, but you almost have like tentacles or arms reaching out at the victims as they liquefy with a great cloud. David, of course, being somewhat He says Byron, of course, when in fact it was Percy Bysshe Shelley. 1818. I believe that was the year Frankenstein was published, first edition, which Shelley had a hand in writing alongside his wife, Mary Shelley. Very sort of Gothic shot here. Here lies Elizabeth Shaw. It's interesting, too. The two of them look fairly similar. Nearly identical twins. And at this point in the film, of course, we have David, who's, of course, lying to us. If you watch Prometheus, you know that he's not to be trusted. Laying a flower at her grave. Duty. I like these. But Ridley Scott, of course, said that, people should suspect that David has switched or swapped sides. The part that's fun is in knowing that David's up to no good, knowing that he's deceptive even now. We'll notice, of course, now with this shot of the alien city, we have the sole neomorph who survived the original gun battle. I'm fairly confident the other one succumbed from its injuries. The last we saw of it was it running away. The shot of the creature, of course, climbing up the wall face, very reminiscent of Gollum, climbing or descending the wall face, and the two towers as it descends upon the hobbits. If you look closely, you can see that Rosenthal has a Star of David necklace. Jewish. Scott also did that in American Gangster, where he had Russell Crowe's character, who was Jewish in that film. Of course, we learned that what Rosenthal here is doing is taking care of her injuries, treating them with what appears to be iodine. She didn't get out of that fight entirely unscathed, and she believes, of course, that she's perfectly safe. She's also somewhat traumatized, so perhaps she's not thinking entirely clearly. We see her pistol next to her. And we can hear the sound effects, of course, of whatever is standing behind her. Turns out they're not quite as safe as David said. I love this shot, too. No facial expressions. The fact that she could even scream after being bit on the throat, so... Some really good gore effects, though. I like that the blood splatters on screen. Like in Braveheart or something like that, where you get blood in the actual lens. And now they've been able to establish comms again because the ship has lowered closer towards the storm. Rix asks about casualties, of course. I like how the wife is kind of giving Rix a look like, come on, back me up. Didn't leave Earth to be safe. And that's definitely a theme that kind of echoes throughout this. You see behind the wife, of course, there's a little spaceman statue hanging from a rope. A little chihuahua. Yeah, there's all sorts of like little props and statuettes and things like that. Now they're flying into the storm. And again, very scenic shots. I apologize if some of this is matter of fact, but again, this movie flies by really quickly. Not sure what he said there. Strafe lock? And of course, now we cut from them talking about Rosenthal to seeing her floating head. She is, of course, quite dead. And the neomorph, after it is sort of chewed on her, it pulls away and we see digital blood leaking from its maw. And it stands up very straight. This is probably my favorite shot in the entire film. Of course, the creature is kind of tilting its head in a cat-like fashion, sort of like Michael Myers after he attacks the guy to the wall with the knife in Halloween. We see it tilting his head side to side. So Orm comes up behind David, who I presume isn't being attacked because he is an android. But there's also a hypnotic quality to David's sort of interaction with it, which perhaps explains why it's not attacking Orm either. Don't shoot. You have to notice that he has a bead on its chest. He can't miss at this range. The creature is very still. I like that. You can see its jaws sort of protruding like a goblin shark. You'll notice that it was caught off guard. He was able to deal several heavy wounds to it before finishing it with a brain shot. And it doesn't bleed acid. As far as I can tell anyways. You don't hear any hissing sound effects. I was wondering what Orm was talking about here. You have to keep in mind at this point in the film, David is, of course, has he done anything directly to fuck up the crew? Not necessarily. Maybe perhaps telling a bit of a white lie when saying that they were perfectly safe. But he did also ostensibly save their lives early on in the film. At this point, all we really know is that David is, of course, being somewhat dishonest towards the crew. But has he poisoned them directly? Has he murdered them himself? No. He didn't kill Ferris. He didn't kill Rosenthal. I like this, of course. This is the point in the film where he has just enough time to grieve after hearing about, and look at that, the doorways of the different segments of the ship. It's almost like a train. Like if you've ever been on a subway car and you can see the cars kind of shifting back and forth. Very much the same idea. And this is going on in the background while he learns of his wife's fate. He has just enough time to sort of shed a few tears about it. But they're undergoing a rescue operation at this point. So how much more time does he have? Can he just afford to break down? No, he has a job to do. And again, some of the egg here that has been sort of sliced into segments has been 3D printed. As David discusses the fiendishly inventive black goo. You have so much detail in regards to everything that David is talking about here. You can almost see it sort of unfolding chronologically, again, a visual narrative. And everything here is, of course, created through 3D printing, just the precision and the level of detail that they're able to sort of have on screen. It's really impressive. And of course, when Adam Savage was talking about it on Wired, he was able to, tested. You could hear the admiration in his voice because there's really a lot to appreciate visually. Beautiful shot, of course, of Michael Fassbender being sort of overwhelmed by the light of Orm's flashlight. The water dripping from the ceiling. This is something that you saw quite a bit in Aliens with the deactivated or destroyed colony. Everything was wet. Everything was dripping wet. Or the chain room in Alien with Brett when he's killed. There's water or condensation constantly dripping from the ceiling. Perfectly safe. Worm is a little bit dumb here. But is he any more dumb than Cain? In the same situation, what did Cain do? He put his face in the egg. And there's no way that, of course, Orm could have anticipated what was inside this egg, predicted how quickly it could have moved. Not that I'm completely defending his actions. But there are stupid characters in every film. Of course, you have George Crumb's Night of the Electric Insects being ripped off by Jed Kurzel and his score. Some good makeup effects here of the facehugger. Some good monster effects here with the creature lying in a puddle of its own blood. They have about 3 different shots of Rosenthal's floating head, sort of like bobbing for apples. What is this guy's name? Beard Guy. It's like certain characters, you don't really know their names, so you just like, you only hear them once. Daniel's sort of taking charge. But again, she's essentially the third officer, the Warren officer. Even then, as far as I understand it, she's actually something of a terraforming officer, taking charge in somewhat of an extraordinary situation. You have the music playing, gradually rising throughout the entire scene, like the scene earlier with the backbursting sequence. And they're sort of improvising here with the landing of the cargo platform. And they're close enough to the planet that they don't have to fly through the storm itself. I always enjoyed this scene where David is essentially just waiting for the creature to be born. And again, everything is really nicely photographed here. You have the smoke and the light. It's very Ridley Scott, just like the shots in Aliens, where James Cameron was paying homage to the Ridley Scott School of Photography when he cut open the door and had the blue laser go inside. No one does it quite like Ridley, though. Creation. Oh, I forgot about that. That's a nice sort of jump scare, if you will. The lens flare is maybe a bit much. A lot of people complain about the fact that the creature is, and you could see Orm's hand sort of twitching in the same fashion that John Hurt did. At this point, of course, he's dead. These are just merely death throes. A lot of people have problems with the ambulatory alien. I didn't really mind it myself. And it kind of acts as sort of a simulacrum or a homunculus version, where he raises his hands, and the creature raises its hands to kind of mimic him. It's almost a coda, if you will, of the scene with Peter Wayland and David at the start of the film. It's the same kind of idea. We have, of course, Walter, who makes the discovery of Elizabeth Shaw has been sort of bound or wired into this organic sort of mainframe, something to... She almost looks like a pod or an egg. She's not really human anymore. She's been reduced. You have to wonder if David is capable of loving in the same fashion as someone human. These scenes kind of remind me of the scenes where Buffalo Bill is in the basement of his home and he's surrounded by trophies of his victims. He has a certain kind of obsession or possessive quality. But you could say that love in and of itself can be possessive or obsessive too. So, again, a commentary on David's humanity, and perhaps Ridley Scott isn't quite as benign as some directors. When we learn that David's motives, it's not just us, the audience, knowing. Now Walter knows as well. They created us. You have a creative cycle, if you will. Again, very photogenic. You have the smoke of the incense burning behind them slowly as the camera sort of drifts towards them. And there's just a lot going on visually. Even the pieces of paper sort of floating in the wind. Who wrote Ozymandias? Byron. Duh. And we have a glitchy moment, of course. You can see a little bit of twitch or faltering in David's behavior, in the same sense that he is very dangerously close to Walter at this point. Extreme close-up, and he's about to sort of inflict his sting. Finally, and he's of course talking about Orem's child, the protomorph. Again, that idea of love from David isn't quite the same kind of love as it is from a normal person who doesn't murder people. His attempt to seduce Walter isn't quite as effective as you might think. He just doesn't know how to respond. Ooh, I forgot about that. It's interesting how he just sort of curls up into a ball after being stabbed in the throat like that. Some type of reflex action, I suppose. You know, blood oozing out of his nose. Straw on the floor. Just little details like that that I didn't pick up on the first time. Again, these sort of motion activated lights that kick on as people walk past them, I always kind of like that. Daniels has returned from outside after relaying her message to Tennessee. They have these little sort of symbols on the wall, writing, if you will. And this is, of course, a classic sort of writing trope where someone, just like in The Shining, where Jack Torrance's wife reads, I'll work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, on page after page. Wendy, light of my life, give me the baseball bat. I don't want to hurt you, I just want to bash your brains in. It's the same idea. So again, this is pretty classic stuff. A point of view shot of beard guy. Chorus? I guess his name is Chorus. They find Orem, who's dead as a doornail, of course. I like how quick the facehuggers are here, too. Very fast. Digital. But and this is perhaps the one film in this series where we see someone actually cut a facehugger off someone's face. The introduction of acid blood. And the creature, of course, dies having administered its fatal payload. Lo and behold, we have Orm's son. And bites him right through the skull. A lot of people have problems with the protomorph design, but I think for the most part it actually works fairly well. And this is where Wendy in The Shining would turn around with a baseball bat. Instead, what we have is Daniels being disarmed fairly easily by David. Not the first time a Ripley-like character has been thrown bodily by an android. What is she? I always wonder what she stabbed him with, and then I remember it's the square nail that she was going to use to build the cabin in the wood, or the cabin by the lake, with her husband. Of course, he died, so she made a necklace out of it. I like how he's like they're talking to each other, and the nail is still stuck into his chin. They're connected in a very perverse kind of way. He's not very good at kissing, I've noticed. She's completely terrified. She's responding about as positively as Walter did. I always liked this scene. I was a huge fan of Terminator 2. Walter was sort of like the T-800. It's a little satisfying, too, to see the villain who's kind of throwing people around get his butt kicked a little bit. It's interesting that they're fighting each other, but they're aiming for pressure points and things like that, and yet they don't respond the way that we would. Robo dropkick. I never really had a problem with that, you know, the martial arts. And of course you have Walter has some type of survival knife, and he and David, of course, are duking it out. But they're not responding to their injuries the way normal people would, and it's kind of satisfying. I always wondered why he hesitated there at the end. That's, of course, a nod to Paradise Lost. And you have the statues of these engineers, or these engineer seedlings, sort of like Lord Nelson in I want to say London. I could be wrong, but again, it's sort of these idols, very very similar to idols that you would see on Earth, just like the Grecian landscape, and the idea that there's a lot of parallels between our civilization and theirs. You could see the beacon, very just little tiny details like that. There's so many things to notice that you never really pick up on the first time. The backpack that someone left behind. Certain people have problems with the protomorph standing up straight and walking on two legs. It's actually sort of optional. It's bipedal, but it can also run on four legs. And I can't tell if its hind legs, excuse me, are like those of Stompy in Alien Isolation. essentially we have the extended foot. I don't think so. You'll notice, of course, that his voice box is sort of damaged. But given the amount of damage that he took, I mean, he was stabbed through the throat with a flute, and David was constantly punching him in the throat as well. Sure, people have problems with this scene, of course. You know, how realistic is this? The idea that her attempt isn't even really that effective to sort of get rid of the creature here. We established several things. One, that the creature can move through the exhaust port of the engine and not be damaged. Purple fire, no less. She landed a shot, but it didn't. I don't even think it punctured the creature's skin. Not my favorite scene in the movie, I will admit, but is something like this technically impossible? I mean, does it feel cartoonish to the point that I think that it couldn't happen? Maybe in one or two spots. It's a little bit extreme. Her sort of swinging from her vine like Tarzan. You see she actually punctured the creature. There's a little bit of blood oozing from its wound. She's being reeled up right next to the exhaust port of the engine. It's all meant to sort of generate tension. She's this close to being wiped out forever. I like that the creature is, of course, headbutting the window at this point. You see a lot of the strength of the creature. It's a nice turning of the tables where Tennessee is worried about safety protocols for a change. Perhaps his were a little bit more immediate. I like that too, that she sort of ducks in and you can see for a brief instant the creature has a transparent dome. She's able to trap it and crush it like a bug. And her trying to sort of stop her fall by digging the axe into the surface of the platform. Very briefly, you can see the creature holding on to her. Kind of reminds me of Linda Hamilton when the Terminator is reaching through the grate of the hydraulic press to try and suffocate her. And we have the xenomorph that has been crushed at this point. Again, a little bit theatrical here. I'm not sure what that landing platform is made out of. Fairly sturdy stuff if it can just decapitate a giant stone statue like that. But again, when I was a kid, I had it was a statue of the Virgin Mary, and it fell over, and it hit its head on the side of her house, which was made out of bricks and concrete blocks, and it decapitated the statue just by virtue of the stone being somewhat brittle. Her head perfectly snapped off. So it's not as though the ship sliced through it. It's just that's how stone functions. It's brittle. It can break. There's a reason we don't make things out of stone nowadays. It's not the Stone Age. We can see the crane, of course, has been melted by the acid, so Daniels has a pretty good idea that the creature bleeds acid. We have a little bit of an allusion there to David being David because of the hood blowing up in the wind, very much like how he was wearing a cowl earlier in the film. Just a little visual nod. Perhaps I'm reading into it too much. And as it flies away, you can see the surface, the faces, Mount Rushmore style, on the side of the mountain. And this is, of course, the point in the film where people have more of a problem. Things move a little bit too quickly. I would call it a segue of sorts. You go from a certain kind of music to something else. If you listen to And Justice for All by Metallica, you have To Live Is To Die, which is a longer, slower piece. And then you have the thrash closer, bookend, Dyer's Eve, is the same kind of idea in this film, where you just have this sudden crescendo at the end, the rising sort of visual crescendo, and the same tradition as Alien, the same tradition as Forbidden Planet. So to me, I'm not really bothered by it. And again, it's sort of you're essentially going from Prometheus to Alien, so there is again a thematic sort of shift as well. At this point, she's unaware of what's going on. We're probably more aware. And he, of course, is sort of riffing off of Walter and saying, oh, it's my duty, because he heard Walter say that. Well, we know this. So the whole point of this is, again, to have a certain amount of drama where we're aware of David's deception, even if Daniels is not. I like that too, that shot where it slowly pulls away. It's very, very reminiscent of the photography in Alien. I like how she puts some Jack Daniels. Oh, okay, I thought she put in the egg for a second. Oh, she gives Tennessee a jolt. And now they finally have a moment to actually grieve, because the mission is ostensibly over, right? And again, another sort of dolly shot as the camera sort of swoops through the ship. This is the moment where we're supposed to think that we're safe. And of course, we have a nod to Alien with the dippy bird. You'll notice that Walter doesn't say that anything's wrong at this stage. Mother's the one who has to point things out. So I guess they brought her back online after the diagnostics. I love this room too. I wish there were more rooms like this. A lot of the hallways and a lot of the halls in the Covenant look fairly similar. Like this one, for instance. Tennessee has a gun, of course. But how useful are weapons like this in outer space? Not very. It's more of a comfort than anything. A feeling of false security, like a talisman. But if they were actually able to fire their weapons, it would probably pierce the hull, or they'd be killed by ricochets. I can't even tell that that's Lope. I mean, if you look closely, you could see the green goo on the side of his cheek. But this was one part of the film that I wish that was a little bit longer. It feels very truncated. In Alien, I think it worked a little bit better, where they just had the beeping dot when Dallas is in the vents. And here, of course, they show the creature. But they also had the point of view shot. And Ridley Scott said, when you see the point of view shot here coming up, the creature is actually hidden by the fact that you're seeing through its eyes. And then, of course, you have the shower scene here, which people complain about. But shower scenes like this have been a movie trope since Psycho, really, or Starship Troopers, something like that. And why wouldn't they celebrate? They just finished the mission. No one knows that there's a creature on board except Mother. They can't hear it because, well, the radio is playing. That's not your penis. Similar shot to the way Rosenthal bought the farm earlier on in the film. And this is essentially a crash course or a truncated version of the ending of Alien. Rix and his wife are deceased at this point, but I'm hoping that for this part of the film we actually do get a longer version of the third act, sort of again a note for note sort of remake of Ripley running around in the ship, finding Parker and Lambert's bodies, just like Daniels in Tennessee found the bodies of Rix and his dearly departed wife. It's interesting at this point. I have to wonder why exactly Walter, aka David, decides to help them. He very easily could have said no. But perhaps he understood that the creature is something that he wouldn't be able to control, and he wants to continue his experiments. And perhaps that's why he helps them sort of kill it. Or perhaps he thought to himself that if he had made his true presence known at this point, that they could have combated him somehow. They could have come to him directly. I hate that special effects shot where the creature goes down the ladder. My least favorite effect shot in the entire film. And this idea of a point of view shot is Scott hiding the creature. It's no different than in Halloween where you have a point of view shot of Michael Myers. One of the few shots where we actually see the creature. But it can't get through the door. At least not right away. Though in Aliens, the creatures, of course, are punching through the steel door, and Vasquez, when she's holding them off for the others to escape in that film. And now you have that pulsating music like earlier in the film during the chestburster sequence. And perhaps David remained incognito because had he revealed himself to them, they could have come for him. But he easily could have locked the doors, right? Kept them in a place and then opened the doors for the creature to come to them. So I'm not entirely sure why Walter decides to say pretend, or why David pretends to be Walter at this stage. Unless he wanted the creature to be killed because he wanted to continue his experiments without a chaotic sort of beast running around. Remember, he wants the ship to be preserved, and perhaps he understands that the creature might not listen to him in the same sense that the Neomorph did. But you never know. In Alien Isolation, the working Joes were ignored by Stompy in that game, so perhaps they would have in Alien Covenant, but there's no way to know, of course. And perhaps that was a chance that Daniels wasn't willing to take. Now we have the creature walking on two legs. Again, some people complain about this. Saved by the fact that it caught its foot on the netting here. I think the creature honestly looks fine moving through here. I wish there were more shots of it on screen. Kind of goes against the Alien sort of aesthetic. I know you got to keep the creature in the dark. A lot of practical effects, though. Most of this is filmed. The creature itself was... Everything here looks great. You know, the moment the airlock doors open and we see that rush of air shortly before everything starts rushing out of the airlock. I'm not sure what all this is. Dust, particles. I guess it's dust. You almost have a Looney Tunes type of chain reaction here where things start to go wrong very badly. Now I think about it, why would David want to destroy his creation? Ah, yes, it's because he has the eggs inside him. He's smuggling. That's a question we might ask ourselves as the scene's going on. But we learn later, of course, this is isn't the only protomorph left. David's eggs are David has eggs inside him, and they are something that he can produce after the creature is destroyed. He's able to maintain control over his experiment. Of course, the smoke and everything here looks great. I have to admit, not my favorite death of an alien creature here. There's no explosion at the end, no music. It's just sort of a matador sort of approach to the creature. Was the creature really that intelligent and alien? Not really. Now, knowing that he is, in fact, David, perhaps he was hoping that they would be defeated. And you have to keep in mind that they almost lost that. They couldn't fire their weapons. They were in kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. And I guess maybe David was kind of hoping that they wouldn't succeed. Again, it's ambiguous. But then again, so were Ash's actions in Alien. The creature on board the ship was essentially a very chaotic element. And why doesn't he say, "Ha! I'm not Walter. I'm David"? But again, it's all about, it's the idea of drama, fooling the audience, having us be kind of suspicious. Well, if he was David, wouldn't he say something? Wouldn't he have said something by now? Why did he help them? So it's as much Ridley Scott playing with the audience as David is. To be suspicious, but not to have proof. And of course, there is sort of a straw that breaks the camel's back when Walter/David doesn't know about the cabin on the lake. And that's sort of what does it. And I like that, there's actual proof or confirmation at that point. What are you talking about, bitch? I guess there's no need for subterfuge anymore. Surprise! And now, with a ship full of colonists, no rogue protomorph on board, David can regurgitate the eggs and resume his experiments. Daniels and Tennessee are contained. He has nothing to sort of stand in his way. Kind of a bad ending, you might say, but I like that. You have to wonder why a David model would be able to interface with the ship, but he is of corporate technology. And of course, Michael Fassbender in real life also speaks German, so he's of course able to pronounce the German. And he spoke German in Inglourious Basterds as well. And of course, he's almost walking through a slaughterhouse at this point, with the colonists hanging from hooks, essentially like meat, if you will. He even calls the infected hosts meat earlier in the film. I read somewhere that Ridley Scott got the idea of regurgitating the eggs the way that drug dealers will regurgitate or void drugs from their body contained in condoms. And you have what I presume are embryos containing miniature facehuggers. These are the culmination of David's research on the planet. And he is able to sort of celebrate his one-upping the ostensible heroes of the story. He is the triumphant hero at this point, though a hero only in his own mind. But as he said earlier, better to reign in hell than rule in heaven. The mind is of its own place where one can make a hell of heaven or heaven of hell. And that's kind of the whole point about David, I think. You'll notice, of course, that he calls himself Walter here, so he again reassumes his subterfuge whenever convenient. Some people said that Julie Payne, they should have paid homage to Geiger, original design elements by H.R. Geiger. But Julie Payne was someone who worked on the production of Alien Covenant, so it'd be pretty rude, I think, if they had decided to ignore her over Geiger, who has plenty of people to sort of lay laurels on his grave, so to speak. So yeah, definitely a good film, guys. Did I like it as much as I did the first time? Well, to be honest, I've been trying to focus on deliver a commentary, so my viewing state of mind is a little bit different than it was when I originally sat down and watched the film with my family. But yeah, no, I enjoyed it. It didn't feel too short to me. I think as far as the pacing goes, I really felt as though, okay, the movie as it moves along, it doesn't feel too short or too long. The only portion of the film that I think maybe feels a little bit too short is the third act. But even that, was it really that big of a problem? As far as I'm concerned, not really. Once you get past the expectations that you want the film to be and you just look at it for what it is, I wasn't bored for a second because, again, this film is very lean. There's no fat. They sort of trimmed all excess fat with this picture. And at times it does move in sort of puzzling directions if you're used to, say, watching the Gothic horror of the first film or the second film, that express elevator ride to hell. But as its own picture, I think, as a standalone picture with its own sort of message that it wants to deliver, I think it works fairly well. I wasn't bored. I didn't really think that any of the characters acted in a stupid manner. For instance, Orem or Tennessee when he's arguing with Rix and his wife about them descending into the planet's atmosphere or anything like that. They're having an argument or a debate, but they're in a situation where they have to make these choices, and it's not as though it's easy to say what the right choice is. Again, Orogai 6, the original sort of projections as far as living on that planet were well and above and beyond eclipsed by this new planet that they had found. And the chances of them making it to Orogai 6 weren't really that high anyways. The captain died 7 years out from Orogai 6. Not to mention, I think there were several other casualties as well. Some of the colonists who were in deep sleep were also killed as well during the storm. So, yeah. I didn't really, watching the film again, I didn't think that the characters were behaving in a stupid way that distracted me from the picture. In the same sense that the stupid behavior in Alien or Aliens doesn't really distract me from those movies. It was what it was. It was entertaining. In any case, we're at about 158, going on 159 here. And I'm sort of blanking out on anything else that I want to kind of talk about here. Definitely going to watch the film again, of course. But I don't think that I will... I'm just curious as to what I'm going to notice about it in regards to, what's positive or what's negative. So anyways, guys, I'm going to cut the commentary short here, a couple of minutes. I really like the film. I like the music. I was noticing all sorts of tiny little things that I didn't notice the first time around. It makes you appreciate a film more once you start to realize that, hey, there's actually stuff here to notice. In any case, guys, Thanks for watching. If you did watch, leave your thoughts or comments below in the comments section. If you like this video, like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, thanks for watching, guys, and stay tuned for more. Cheers.